Life in the Trinity Ministry, in partnership with Brian McLaren, is pleased to present this series entitled The Storyline of the Bible.
Great to be with you today. We're working our way through the biblical story. We're trying to get a big picture for the flow of the biblical story. We're looking at 7 episodes: creation, crisis, calling, conversation, Christ, community, and celebration or consummation. And these 7 episodes, we hope, will help us to really understand how God is at work in the world so that we can fit in. We're not just learning about ancient history. We're learning about a story that we actually find ourselves in. We're thinking about a story that we participate in. And that today, whether we realize it or not, will contribute to or maybe work against or enrich. And so this is not just abstract theology. This really relates to the daily lives of every human being on the planet. And we're in this 4th episode, the episode of conversation. And we, over the last couple of podcasts, have looked at the story of Moses, and we've tried to reflect, I hope in some ways that have been helpful for you, on this fascinating kind of prime example of a conversation between a human being and God. We've noticed how this conversation gives room for the human being to doubt and question and push back. It's not domineering and overpowering, and yet it really brings Moses somewhere. It sets a new course for his life. He's not the same after this experience, and in fact, the history is never going to be the same because of that experience. And I wanted to just skip ahead a little bit farther in this interchange between Moses and God and what this is going to mean in his life. And this is at the end of chapter 6 of the book of Exodus. Now, when the Lord spoke to Moses in Egypt, he said to him, I am the Lord. Tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, everything I tell you. But Moses said to the Lord, since I speak with faltering lips, why would Pharaoh listen to me? Now, whether this is a repeat of an earlier story or the same theme coming back again in Moses' life, some of you will remember this is one of Moses' original responses when God spoke to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, this is the beginning of chapter 7, see, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be your prophet. You are to say everything I command you, and your brother Aaron is to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his country. Now, the reason I wanted to point out that unusual little passage there, even though it seems somewhat repetitive to what we've heard before, is that this seems to be a place where we get a definition of a very important word in conversation, and that's the word prophet. A lot of people today, when they hear the word prophet, they think that we mean someone who tells the future. And actually, telling the future is relatively rare among the prophets. And in fact, the way that they tell the future is very different from the way we expect. In many ways, the job of a prophet is to tell the future so that it won't happen. Now, maybe an analogy I could give would be if 2 brothers are playing out in the backyard and they're doing something I know my brother and I used to do when we were little kids. We would have sword fights. And my mother would look out the back door and yell out to us, if you boys keep playing sword fights with sticks like that, somebody's really going to get hurt, and somebody's going to put an eye out. Well, that she's making a prophecy. If you keep playing like that, somebody's going to get hurt, somebody's eye is going to get put out. I think every boy who ever has played rough with his friends has heard that prophecy. The purpose of the prophecy is not to guarantee to us that this will happen. It's so that we'll stop acting the way we are in hopes that our behavior will change. And I think that this is the bulk of even the predictive prophecy that we find in the Bible, that when someone is telling the future, it's very, very often for the purpose of telling people that they better change their behavior. Now, sometimes it's for the purpose of telling people to prepare, and that's because certain chains of events are in motion, and God is warning the people to prepare. But most of the work of prophets is not predicting the future. Most of the work of prophets is to say everything God has commanded them. So they have a conversation with God, they hear something, and they have the job to pass it on. And here it's as if God is saying, you're my prophet, Moses, but since you are so insecure about your speech, I'll speak to you, you'll speak to Aaron, and Aaron will be your prophet, your mouthpiece to the people. Now, the reason I wanted to pause for a few minutes to talk about prophets is because this conversation that goes on in the Bible is a conversation with several different kinds of participants. And maybe the key participant are these people called prophets. And Moses is, we might say he's the first of these prophets. He's the first person given a message that he's supposed to give to other people. And isn't it interesting? The message doesn't just go to his fellow Israelites. The message also goes to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And the message relates to liberation, to the ending of oppression, and to the forwarding of God's story, because God doesn't want his people to be slaves forever, and he wants them to be liberated. And prophets are going to play this role throughout the rest of the story. They're going to have an encounter with God. They're going to hear something from God that it's their responsibility to pass on, and passing on this story will call other people to action, which will change history and further the story. So these prophets have a very important role. But they don't work alone. And right away, we have Moses working with Aaron. Now, Aaron is in a sense, Moses' mouthpiece, but then Aaron is given another job. He's given the job of starting a second category of participants in the conversation, and they are the priests. Aaron begins a line of priesthood, and the priests have a very different role. No one expects the priests are going to hear a message from the Lord to pass on to everybody else. What they expect the priests to do is put into practice the instructions that come to the people through, in this case, through Moses, on how to order their lives in relation to God. So the priests are in charge of what we might say is the pastoral care of the people. They're in charge of helping the people have a worship life. By that I mean a life of public ritual and a life of marking important events in their individual and corporate lives. The priests are in charge of the festivals that are going to give shape to the life of the people of Israel. So we might say the priests are in charge of the spiritual formation of the people, and they will lead the people in the people's encounter with God, and they will make sure that the people hear the voice of the Lord through the prophets. So it's an interesting relationship and an important relationship. And as we'll see, a relationship of some dynamic tension with priests and prophets. But then when the priests organize the public worship life of the people, they need words to use in their gatherings. And they need words to give to the people to help the people express themselves to God. And those words are in the form of beautiful, sacred poetry. And that's the third category of participants in this conversation, the poets. They work closely with the priests. They also are closely related to the prophets because, interestingly, the prophets, most of the messages of the prophets, come to the people in the form of poetry. Now, I want to pause and say something about the importance of poetry in ancient civilizations. Remember, most of these people are illiterate. Writing is a relatively rare capacity, and reading relatively rare. So most of the people's encounter with history and with theology and with any form of public culture is going to be oral rather than written. It's going to be spoken and heard. So for that reason, the form of the word that's spoken is very important. It has to be in a very memorable form. And so Hebrew poetry is the preferred form of the prophets, not exclusive, but preferred form of the prophets to bring the messages of the Lord to the people. And it's the form that is used by the people in expressing themselves to God through their memorized prayers. So we have the prophets. They bring a word from God to the people. They have an encounter with God and then pass on the message that they're given. The priests help the people develop an ordered, regulated, common life of worship in relationship to God. Then the poets participate by writing beautiful words and beautiful prayers that express the heart of the people to God and reflect the meditations and reflections of the people so that they can have in a memorable form important elements of their own spiritual life. So we have prophets, priests, and poets. Then we have another group of people who are part of this conversation. And I'm going to call them the philosophers or the sages. And these are people who have a fascinating relationship. They're sort of independent of the prophets and the priests. They have overlap with the poets because their writing is in Hebrew poetic form. Again, because most people would not encounter these words through paper or parchment or clay tablets. They would encounter them in the ritual life of the people, these beautiful memorized poems. So a lot of the philosophers in the Bible write in the form of poetry, and they have a very important job. And again, we're going to come back to it later in some detail. But they engage in reflection on the whole conversation that's going on with God. They ask questions. They doubt things. They overturn things. It's very, very interesting and very important part of the conversation. The voice of the philosophers is part of the conversation. In the Old Testament, we have the book of Proverbs, which represents one kind of philosophical reflection, very practical philosophy. We have a book like Ecclesiastes, which is showing that the people of God are given permission to doubt and question in the midst of this conversation. Then we have the book of Job, which I see as an even more provocative form of philosophical reflection. And I actually would include the book of Jonah in this category as well, and we'll come back to that later. Prophets, priests, poets, philosophers. And then, of course, we have the storytellers or the historians. Now, I think it's better to use the word storyteller than historian, because when we hear the word history, we're prone to bring a lot of modern assumptions about what history is. For example, the modern discipline of science didn't exist in the ancient world, so there can be no scientific writing in the ancient world. And there's a modern discipline of history as well, archaeology, history, that just didn't exist in the ancient world. They had a different approach to history, and we have to respect their approach and enter their historical writings on their own terms. It's unfair for us to expect a storyteller of the 6th century BC to play by the rules, for example, of a journalist or a history professor at a university in the 21st century. So let's take these voices: prophets, priests, poets, philosophers or sages, and the storytellers or historians. And let's imagine them now being involved in a multifaceted conversation. And what they're doing is they're all revealing what they're hearing from God, and then how they respond to what they hear from God, and how they respond to each other about this. And this community of people is now not only in conversation with God, speaking and listening to God, but now they're in conversation with each other, speaking and listening to each other. And not just in one historical setting, but this conversation now can carry on over generations, carried on by oral tradition, because people would hear this beautiful, memorable, poetic form, and they would hear it so many times at different holidays and in their family and in their home that they would commit it to memory. They would know it by heart, and it would be passed on from parents to children, generation after generation. Now, this is a lot of us, when we approach the Bible, we don't accept it as a conversation. We accept it as a dictation. We think that somehow that God dictated a bunch of things to people, and that all we really have is monologue from the mouth of God. But I think it helps us, and I think we're being more fair to the Scriptures when we respect the dynamic of conversation and dialogue. And one good way, I think, for us to get an understanding of this is by looking at one of the books that is both philosophy and poetry. It's the book of Job. And the book of Job tells us a story. Now, to some people, it would be very important for them to say that this is a historic story. I personally don't think it's necessary to believe it's historic. You certainly can if you want. But most people don't speak in long, extended passages of poetry as the people do in this story. And the fact that it's given that their conversation are in long, poetic speeches suggests to me that this is not intended to be a transcript of actual conversation. But what we have is the story of this man named Job. And Job goes through some terrible, terrible misfortune. All of his family is killed except his wife, and his wife ends up hassling him all the time. He's stricken with terrible physical disease, and he's just in not only terrible relational agony from losing his family, and physical agony, and emotional agony, but he also has the kind of spiritual agony, because he's thinking, if there is a good God in heaven who loves me, why would he let these terrible, terrible things happen? And in fact, when we have Job speak in Job chapter 3, after he goes through these terrible times, he's approached by a group of friends, 3 friends. One's Eliphaz, one is Bildad, and one is Zophar, and they come around him and just feel his pain. In fact, they sit on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one says a word because they see how great his suffering is. They just feel his pain. And then after 7 days, Job speaks. Now again, you may want to take this all literally, but to me, let's just take this as a story that's supposed to convey important meaning to us, and a story that truly is a gift from God. But it could be a story the way Jesus told parables, or it could be, if you prefer, a literal story. But Job opens his mouth, and here's what it says. He cursed the day of his birth. He said, "May the day of my birth perish. And the night it was said, a boy is born. That day, may it turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine upon it. May darkness and deep shadow claim it once more. May a cloud settle over it. May blackness overwhelm its light. That night, may thick darkness seize it. May it not be included among the days of the year, nor be entered in any of the months. May that night be barren. May no shout of joy be heard in it. May those who curse days curse that day. Those who are ready to rouse Leviathan, which is this primal sea monster in ancient mythology. May its morning stars become dark. May it wait for daylight in vain, and not see the first ray of dawn. For it did not shut the doors of the womb on me to hide trouble from my eyes." I hope you can see what is being expressed here is rage and agony. Why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb? Why were there knees to receive me and breasts that I might be nursed? For now I would be lying down in peace. I would be asleep and at rest with kings and counselors of the earth who built for themselves places now lying in ruins, with rulers who had gold and filled their houses with silver. Why was I not hidden in the ground like a stillborn child, like an infant who never saw the light of day? There the wicked cease from turmoil. There the weary are at rest. Captives also enjoy their ease. They no longer hear the slave drivers shout. The small and the great are there. The slave is freed from his master. Now, there's all kinds of interesting things going on here. One of which is we can see that people in Job's day had a very, very different picture of death than we might assume. In their mind, the place of death was where all people slept and rested in peace. But what we have here is Job expressing agony. And then what happens is his series of friends respond to him. And they argue with him. And they say, you shouldn't be so mad. You shouldn't be so unhappy. You must have done something to deserve this. And one after another gives him a long speech. And their speeches sound so right. I mean, their speeches sound more right than Job's speech. They basically say, you shouldn't question God. For example, Eliphaz in Job chapter 4 says, can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his maker? And so there's this constant correction of Job for his angry and bitter venting. And then Job replies, and then another one of his friends replies, and this goes on page after page. And by far the people who sound holy are Job's friends, Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar, and then later another friend comes to join them. But what is really striking about the book of Job is when we get to the end of the book of Job, after all of this conversation, page after page after page, the Lord speaks. He speaks in chapter 38. Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm. He said, "Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." And so God now engages with Job and asks Job all kinds of questions. God, who's been silent through the whole conversation, now comes in. And the way he comes in is mostly by just asking questions, and questions about creation. And in a sense, asking Job to look at the wonder and mystery and drama of creation, and basically says, you can never really fully understand God. And then Job replies, "Oh my goodness, you're right. I was speaking way beyond what I ever should have said." And then what is really striking, and the conversation between God and Job continues. But then, here's the Lord gets the final word. And when you get to chapter 42, here's what we read in verse 7. After the Lord had said these things to Job, he said to Eliphaz the Temanite, "I am angry with you and your two friends, because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." Now, what is so striking about this is Job is the one who has been questioning God and expressing rage toward God and being frustrated with God. Remember what we said last time about how Moses argues with God. And in a sense, Job's three friends have been the ones who have constantly been saying that they properly, that they understand how things are with God. And they've been saying all the pious and sanctimonious things, which sound an awful lot more righteous than what Job has said. But now God says Job is the one who is actually right. And in fact tells them they should go ask Job to pray for him. I just think the book of Job itself is an amazing work of a philosopher and a poet, to tell us that the conversation about God doesn't just occur through one person speaking. It occurs, the truth about God, the voice of the Lord is heard after many people's voices have been heard. And then the truth out of these many voices begins to emerge. And that sometimes the people who seem the most wrong are the people who really were right, and the people who seem the most right were really wrong. Now, I just challenge you to look at the book of Job in that light and think about what it says to us in general about the conversation with God. And what that might mean for us then is that when we read the Bible, we can't read it as a dictation. We have to read it as a dramatic conversation between prophets, priests, poets who give voice to the voice of the people back to God, philosophers, and the storytellers who are trying to bring all of this together and give it some kind of historical shape. Well, that's a conversation that you and I are part of today. And I think this gives us a sense of humility to realize that as partakers in this conversation with and about God, that we are humble participants, and that we have to have wisdom arise among us as we are part of this conversation. It's not just an easy answer and a little dictation from God. It's this mysterious, rich, dynamic conversation. I'm Brian McLaren, and this is Wired Parish. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to WiredParish.com. Visit us online for exclusive podcasts with some of the most challenging writers, thinkers, and speakers in the church. We bring you coffeehouse conversations with the best and the brightest. Tune in, turn on, get wired. WiredParish.com.